All right, we're going to move in here looking at the presidents of the 90s and 2000s. Here we see George H.W. Bush, the first George Bush. We'll take a look at his domestic and foreign policy accomplishments. In domestic politics, George Bush teaches us a very important lesson. Now, George Bush campaigned on a promise that he would not raise taxes, but he inherited a problem from Reagan. We mentioned that Reagan cut the taxes a lot and increased the spending a lot, so there were huge deficits, and Bush had to deal with those deficits. So the problem is Bush promised not to raise taxes, but he did raise taxes, and he raised taxes right before an election. So this teaches us a very important political lesson that American political leaders should not be raising taxes before an election. You tend to make the voters very upset. One of the important laws passed under George Bush here is the Americans with Disabilities Act. We learned about this much earlier in Chapter 3. This requires all places of public accommodation to make reasonable accommodations for people with various physical disabilities. So this was a mandate from the United States government for places to add things like ramps and elevators and handicap access to all their different buildings that serve the public. Bush's domestic policy goal, he called this 1,000 points of light. He wanted to really emphasize American people's responsibility to do things. So it was a lot of programs of like volunteer programs and sponsoring things like that to get American citizens involved in solving the problems of American cities and neighborhoods. In foreign policy, Bush is the president when the Soviet Union actually breaks up. So this is the official end of the Cold War. So Bush has to negotiate things with the end of the Soviet Union and begin the transition from the Soviet Union back to Russia. Together, the United States and Russia negotiate several treaties where they reduce the amount of weapons that they have. George H.W. Bush is president when the United States invades Iraq. The United States beginning its first Persian Gulf War, its first war with Iraq, to deal with a dictator there, Saddam Hussein. We'll come back to him in a few minutes with the other President Bush. And President Bush began negotiations for a program called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So this is a program that Bush and Clinton work on together that is an agreement between the United States and Canada and Mexico to have one big zone of trade between the three countries. Our president for most of the 1990s is President Bill Clinton. So here's Clinton in the Oval Office. We'll look at his domestic and foreign policy achievements. He's a lot like Nixon earlier. We mentioned that Nixon, being a Republican president, has a lot of policies that don't look like Republican policies. Clinton, being a Democrat president, is going to have a lot of policies that do not look like Democratic policy. In domestic politics, this is a lot of stuff for Bill Clinton here. These are a lot of programs that really cut the spending of the government. He was a very fiscally responsible president here. So the first of these is he completes the NAFTA agreement. He creates a free trade zone between the United States and Canada and Mexico. This is a policy that is very pro-business, and it really hurts American workers. And this is one of those things that really helps American businesses become very successful. They can move their jobs into different countries like Mexico, and they can make the goods cheaper and things like that. Bill Clinton also does criminal justice reform. He put in very, very harsh penalties. This is a continuation of the Reagan war on drugs. So very, very harsh penalties for different crimes, mandatory sentences for different like types of drug trafficking and things like that. These will be problems that other presidents in the future will have to solve. Clinton also makes a lot of changes to the welfare program. So his program of welfare reform reduces benefits and cuts programs to people who need help from the government. So this is where Clinton is really reducing the program. So this would be an example of Clinton as a Democrat. He's doing the opposite programs of an earlier Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson. So just important for us to see that the parties don't necessarily stay the same over time. The party's ideas on issues change over time. Under Bill Clinton, there were a couple of laws about gay rights here. So the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Act allowed for homosexuals to serve in the United States military as long as they weren't openly homosexual. And the Defense of Marriage Act allowed some states to have same-sex marriage, but did not force any. It said that the other states did not have to recognize those. So at the time, in the 1990s, this was seen as President Clinton trying to help the gay community, but In this case, both of these laws would end up being not necessarily successful policies, being things that presidents in the future would have to work to overturn. Now, one of the important things about Bill Clinton here is he achieved a budget surplus. This is so insanely rare for United States presidents. He cut so many programs. The United States was spending so much less money on programs that the government was actually making money. This is so rare for the United States, but this is a big deal because the United States would be able to invest in all sorts of programs for the future, like Social Security and things like that. In foreign policy, Bill Clinton is the first president we're dealing with that does not have the Cold War to deal with. So he's president during a time of peace. And so his foreign policy is very different than the presidents before him. His big achievement would be completion of the NAFTA agreement. This is an economic agreement between the United States and Canada and Mexico. He did intervene in some small conflicts in other countries. So he intervened in conflicts in Yugoslavia and Kosovo and Somalia. But with Bill Clinton, he was using NATO, the United States military alliance, as a peacekeeping force. So he was kind of using the United States military to act as police around the world to make sure that small conflicts did not escalate. He expanded NATO, so he invited a lot of old Soviet Union countries to join the United States military alliance, and this is seen as a way to extend peace agreements all over Europe. And instead of using military force very often, Bill Clinton started using economic sanctions as a weapon. So he would punish countries economically, like refuse to trade with them or refuse to sell them goods in a way to punish them, to try to get them to cooperate with the United States instead of using military force. After Clinton, we have George Bush's son, George W. Bush, become president. He's president for most of the first decade of the new millennium here. Here he is sitting in the Oval Office with his two adorable doggies hanging out, looking out the window here. Domestic policy for George W. Bush. Let's think back to Reagan. Reagan was proposing that we need to cut taxes using supply-side theory. And think back to Clinton. Clinton cut the spending so much that the United States was making money and could invest in programs to help people. George Bush took this surplus and gave huge tax cuts as one of his first things in office. So he enacted big tax cuts, reducing taxes again in the United States. So taking that big budget surplus and turning it into another deficit here. As president, he put in place a policy called No Child Left Behind. This is the reason why we have so many standardized tests every year. He wanted to make sure that every school nationwide was giving, every state was implementing standardized testing at the end of many grades so that we would find ways to measure schools and find the schools that were successful and the ones that were not. One of the big things as president, he had to deal with the September 11th terrorist attacks. And so one of the laws passed after that was the Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act gave the president many new powers to monitor the activities of American citizens and make sure that they were not planning terrorist attacks of their own. So under George Bush, the president has many new powers to monitor people's electronic communication, like email and phone calls and text, to find their records for like library books and Google searches and medical records and things. So this really, really gave the president a lot of power to monitor American citizens. And under President Bush, this was a big time growth of the national security apparatus in the government. So there are a lot of new agencies coming around here in this time that monitor the activity of American citizens to make sure that they're not causing problems. In foreign policy, we mentioned that early in his first term, there were terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001, attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. This really changed American foreign policy for a long time. So Bush declares a war on terror. This is a very, kind of like a war on cancer, a war on drugs. It's vague. It allows the president to do all sorts of things in the idea of fighting terrorism. So it kind of gave the president permission to fight in a lot of different places here. So first, the United States went to war in Afghanistan. They went to war in Afghanistan because Afghanistan was the place where the terrorists who attacked the United States were living and kind of working. They weren't like from Afghanistan, but that's where they were camping out and training. So the United States went to war in Afghanistan, and overthrew the government there, but was not able to really make Afghanistan stable or create a new government for Afghanistan. We're still fighting this war today in 2020. The United States has continued fighting in Afghanistan ever since October of 2001. A couple years later, President Bush, this is going to be the big thing that we associate with President Bush, is the war in Iraq. So a second war in Iraq trying to take out Saddam Hussein here. This is a really controversial war because the Bush administration was not honest with the American people about the reasons for going to war. This was lumped in as part of the war on terrorism, and there were accusations that Iraq was building weapons to use against the United States. But this is important. This is a really important war in the United States because this is the first time that the United States is going to war with a country without being attacked first. So this is a new power for the president because this is the president going to war with a country because they seem like a threat. So this is like a preemptive war. We went to war with them before they were able to do something bad to us. And so this is a really this is a new step for the United States in foreign policy. All right, close to the end here. We've got to President Barack Obama, president from 2009 to 2017. Here he is standing in the Oval Office, and we'll discuss. With these most recent presidents, we don't really know which of their actions will have the most lasting impact yet, but we'll discuss a few domestic and foreign policy accomplishments of Obama. Domestic policy achievements under Obama. Now, he was an incredibly popular candidate. He had a big-time coattail effect. So Obama came into office in 2009 with a 60-vote majority in the Senate and the majority in the House for his party, the Democrats. So he could have passed almost any law through Congress if his party would have cooperated. And the first law that was passed by this was the Affordable Care Act, what we call Obamacare. This is a big expansion in the role of the federal government as an insurance provider. So this expanded the United States government into providing insurance for more people who could not afford health insurance, and to provide a place to sell insurance to people whose jobs did not provide insurance. Also passed several laws to reform the practices of investors on Wall Street, because Obama came in during an economic collapse, like a stock market crash emergency, and so he passed a lot of laws that changed the way that stocks were traded, and that ways that people could invest on Wall Street to try to prevent the problems of the 2008 economic collapse. And his criminal justice reform here is attempting to reverse the policies put in place by Bill Clinton. So Bill Clinton had put in several harsh policies, harsh punishments for people, particularly people with the drug trade. And Obama was trying to reduce the number of people in jail for these type of things and reduce the length of sentences for these types of nonviolent crime activities. In foreign policy, we don't know a whole lot about which of Obama's accomplishments will be kind of long-lasting here. He attempted to end both the wars in Iraq and the wars in Afghanistan that were started under George W. Bush, but neither of these were successful while he was in office. He was not able to end either of these wars. These are both still ongoing here. He was able to order the strike that killed Osama bin Laden, who was the mastermind of the September 11th terrorist attack. So this was a big deal in American foreign policy. We mentioned how the president is in charge of diplomatic relations, and so the President Obama tried to normalize diplomatic relations with Cuba. This would be the first time that the United States and Cuba worked together on things since President Kennedy. And Obama also tried to negotiate with Iran and was able to work out a treaty where Iran would not be able to make nuclear weapons. And so this was an agreement between the United States and Iran that would end Iran's nuclear program. Finally, we come to our most recent president. We'll talk very briefly about President Trump. We don't know of what President Trump has accomplished. What of those things will be lasting in terms of policy impacts, but President Trump definitely changed a little bit about the role of the president. In President Trump's time in office here, the big accomplishment for President Trump was further tax cuts. So this would be additional tax cuts. So these took place under President Reagan and under President Bush and under President Trump now. So we see a pattern of Republican presidents continuing to cut taxes. So this was the big policy achievement of President Trump and Congress that cooperated with him. But probably the biggest impact of President Trump would be the way that President Trump dealt with the media. President Trump was particularly innovative in using the bully pulpit. Of course, having lived through it, you guys will all remember how much President Trump used Twitter. And this was really a new way for the president to interact directly with the American people. So we saw the president's thoughts in real time, and the president would mention policy goals and things like that on Twitter, but also like attack his political enemies and things like that, and also was very critical of the media the whole time in office. And so this will probably be one of those things that has a lasting impact on presidents in the future. They saw how Trump was able to reach so many voters that way, using something like social media to convince voters to only listen to the president and to not listen to media organizations and things like that. So we'll see if presidents in the future learn from this strategy or try to adopt any of that. Now, President Trump also reversed as many of President Obama's policy achievements as he could. So he did this through executive order. So President Obama had to change a lot of things through executive order. President Trump was able to reverse all of those executive orders. Now, since most of what President Trump did was through executive order, it will be very easy for President Biden to reverse those right back. That's kind of the problem with executive orders for president. It is a good tool because it can help them do something quickly and efficiently, but it is not good because it does not have a lot of lasting power. The next president can come along and basically just erase what you did. So we'll see if any of President Trump's executive orders will survive through the Biden presidency here. So President Trump was able to get rid of a lot of regulations on businesses and things like that through executive order. All right, and here we have some of our former presidents and their spouses. So we have President Trump and his First Lady Melania, President Obama and his First Lady Michelle, and President Clinton, his First Lady Hillary, and President Carter way there in the back, and his First Lady Rosalind. This is at the funeral of George H.W. Bush. And so this is one of those times when all of the former presidents come together. But we're going to take a quick second and discuss our big ideas here. All right, so for the AP test, we do need to have some idea of what policies we can associate with what presidents here. These are definitely not the only things that those presidents did, but I tried to hit some of the highlights in domestic and foreign policy here because these are the kind of things that occasionally pop up in a multiple choice question. So we might need to be able to, for example, think about when I see new federalism, that's something I need to associate with Nixon. Or when I see something like the Vietnam War, that would be something I associate with President Johnson. But the main thing here is we want to know examples and be able to explain examples of how actions have expanded the power of the presidency. So if I go all the way back to Eisenhower, I talked about, he used the army to enforce the law, like to desegregate schools. And so that kind of thing stands as an important example of the president expanding their role and expanding the intended powers of the president. So those are the kind of things that we would use as examples when we're explaining things in an FRQ question. All right, and so today what we were able to do is look back at our modern presidents and see the way that they have changed the role of the president and expanded their powers. What we'll do for the rest of the time we explore the president, we'll kind of shift into those things surrounding the president. So shift into the staff and the processes associated with the president.